Hi, I'm Simran, and today I'm going to be talking about horror movies, which are an outlet for the harsh realities. A lot of horror movies are seen as fun or just gimmicky things for teenagers, our age demographic, and older or younger to watch that are very frightening, but there's a reason for these movies being so terrifying or sometimes so comical. So, horror movies is a genre that I often relate to Gothic literature, and in the Gothic, there's a lot of suppression and repression of trauma, which always comes back to surface, like the dark realities of the human experience. Horror movies are the same, except it's visualized, it's conceptualized through movies, and with different ways of using film work and all this, it helps create a new meaning to the harsh realities of the human experience, the extreme of the spectrum for human experience. Each of us have a very difficult time at some point in our lives, and with that, horror movies are just an extremity of that. Now, my reason for talking about this topic for my TED Talk is to be about how we can relate horror movies in a much more real way, applying them to our lives, applying them to the situations around us, crimes around us, and things like that. With the use of horror movies beyond just the entertainment, it can help people realize what happens when you suppress these things. How does suppressing these things and trying to get rid of what scares you ultimately lead to a demise or lead to some sort of fault? I've decided to talk about this topic also because of my personal interest. I personally have loved watching horror movies from such a young age, and I was always terrified, especially of jump scares and things like that. And with that, it's very real as well. I also love reading Gothic literature, and with things like that, with movies like Frankenstein, based off of the novel Frankenstein, you can see how in that book, Frankenstein is basically creation of what is life? What is the meaning of being alive? What does it mean to be a real person? What qualities, what morals does someone have to have? And does looks come into that? Does looks come into play with how people perceive you and things like that? Now, leading into some examples, imagine the horror of horror movies in everyday life and what that means. And what if I told you that it's actually all around us in ways that we don't even realize? One really good example of horror movies in everyday life is the horror that's in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, of course, it's a murderous movie, but beyond that, at the beginning, we see a slaughterhouse, and basically, this movie commentates on the inhumane treatment and cruelty of animals. The same way that these humans are being so tortured is similar to how many animals are faced with cruelties in many different farms and many different things like that. The film uses a lot of sounds that help amplify that effect, with screeching pig sounds, screeching chickens, and humans, all to amplify that feeling of intense fear or just a comical sense that allows us to see that in a subliminal way what cruelty does, and imagining this cruelty that is faced on these teenagers and people in Texas, same way applied to these innocent animals that are being slaughtered unrightfully. Another really good example of horror movies in real life is The Fly. It's a very odd movie that talks about very basically a guy turning into a fly, and it leads to quite a moral dilemma because of the extra hairs growing, the weird textured skin, the eyes, and things like that. Is a commentary on aging and how aging is so not perceived very well in society. And with that, it also comments on epidemics faced around us. And at that time, there was a huge epidemic going around. And with things like that, these movies help to keep in mind this fear installed in us also creates a subliminal message of what things not to go around, what to be aware of. It creates a fight or flight sense. And with that, if we can apply these horror movies to real life situations like the harsh realities of motherhood that Silent Hill kind of works with and things like that, it can help us bring more awareness and a broader sense to what's happening around us and how we can lessen the extremities of the human experience that get to be so tough. As I was mentioning the Gothic earlier, there's a really good example of this coming from the University of Tulsa from Professor Dennis, and in this he talks about Frankenstein, mentioning how that the scientist creates this being, but what does it mean to live a full life? What does it mean to have a full, complete life? And this book is very essential because the author, Mary Shelley, faced a lot of difficulties with motherhood. She had many miscarriages and she was very young, as well as a very intense and well-renowned husband, which made her writing seem very insignificant in comparison to his. But with these struggles of motherhood and trying to have children that she can nurture and care for, came along the idea of Frankenstein, of what does it mean to create life? What does it mean to have a full life? And with the horrors of her life implicated this beautiful piece of work, Frankenstein, that really exemplifies an extremity of how intense that feeling is and those questions of morality and what comes up and what comes down. And with a lot of people our age right now, our age demographic, older or younger, the Gothic is very topical, and it helps us to speak on like the psychological and mental issues that people face daily, or the reality of grieving, what it means to grieve a loss of a thing or a person or a memory, and things like that can help us realize what it means to suppress these things. And with horror movies, we can really relate the Gothic in the sense of what is the underlying issue? What has happened in this person's life? What trauma has caused them to become this way? Almost as if it's like a warning sign for people like us or our age or things like that. There's a lot of negative connotation with the word Gothic being demonic or things like that. But with the Gothic, it can really help us start to realize things and hopefully help people watching this or things like that take into consideration while watching these movies or reading these books that this could be a very real feeling and intense thought of someone who's going through similar issues, like animals per se. For in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there was those young teenagers facing the brutality of just a serial killer on the loose. And with things like that, we can start to take into consideration these animals that are being treated unfairly, or in Silent Hill, what it means to be a mother, the unique signs and stuff that we see from the crimson walls that are starting to peel is like peeling back the layers of a person and realizing, who am I, what's my role, how do I take care of another being who I don't want to live the same fate as me. So to get more into it, beyond horror movies being very exciting and thrilling, the reason we consume horror so much is because it gives us a stimulation, anticipating terrifying events or acts. Like going through a haunted house can be very terrifying as it's just happening to you. There's jump scares and things like that. And with that, it creates chemicals in our brains that help us, release that flight or fight or that tension or suspension that almost amps us up and gives us energy or absolutely terrifies us. In this article from the Harvard Business Review, it also talks about how we seek horror through movies to gain experience and knowledge to how to handle real life situations or possible situations. For example, lots of people are obsessed with like what will happen when the apocalypse happens. What if there's a zombie apocalypse? What if aliens invade? Things like that are very significant to understanding, okay, what is this person afraid of? And how are these movies that we're seeing altering us in a way that makes us gain the experience from another person or character going through it? How do we learn from this as humans, our instinct to protect ourselves and save ourselves? Another quote that I really like that I think will really sum up the importance of learning how horror movies are really a reality of human experience is, observing storylines in which actors must confront the worst parts of themselves serves as a pseudo-character study of the darkest parts of the human condition. The human condition can be very light to very extreme. Every single one of us has gone through something in our lives, and with using something like horror to help bring that excitement or even help us move through these things can be a really powerful thing. So not only when people are watching these horror movies that they see, this is a really good movie, look at the effects, look at the sounds, that now people can have a little bit more perspective on what horror movies really mean, digging deeper into the movie, and maybe even when you dig deeper, it can help you create a sense of connectivity with these movies, something to remember and also learn from. And to kind of finish off, horror movies can be a really fun group activity, as well as like when you're sitting with others and the excitement and fear all together, that thrilling anxiety that people feel when watching these horror movies can be really good and a very good bonding experience, which is very good for our brain chemicals, releasing serotonin and things like that. Thank you.